Jason, are you going to do an entire episode on just a few lines and a font? Well, yes, I am. I guess if you haven't been following so far, this is right up my alley. Here's how a few lines and a font helped define me as a person. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Now, when I'm talking about a few colored lines, I'm specifically talking about the racquetball courts at the All Sport Fitness Center in Fishkill, New York, which was a relatively modern outlook on a gym in New York in the 1970s. The idea of a super gym, a gym that would have a pool and a sauna and racquetball courts and even dining and hangout areas, almost a mall of fitness. At the time that it was built, I'm sure it felt almost like somebody was building a casino on the edge of town. Fishkill wasn't that big, and the idea of a Megagym probably caused a few meetings and a number of opinions as it was being built. For my family, this was an opportunity for my parents to be able to drop me and my siblings off somewhere for a while, especially during those summer months when it's so hard to schedule a visitation between divorced parents. All Sport had exercise classes, it had memberships, and most importantly, it had a racquetball summer camp for kids. This meant that I was literally dropped off at a gym as if it was a summer camp, and we would have coaches/counselors waiting for us, and we would be taught racquetball, the rules, the process, and to various degrees, these were very young kids and early teenagers all working together to learn racquetball. All Sport had a pretty sizable amount of these racquetball courts, and if you don't know or don't remember the rules of racquetball, just think of a gym floor and a large four-walled room accessible by a tiny door, and you had a racket, so much like the rules of tennis, there were foul lines and processes for calling balls, and the main difference between this and tennis or badminton was the ability to bounce the balls off of the walls and ceiling as you needed to. Adding these additional factors into a game was considered progress. The way we often take a sport and quote-unquote update it is to add a factor that wasn't there before. And being stuck in a small enclosed room with a racquetball and somebody else or several somebody else's, well, that's how racquetball worked. So we kids would go into this echoey room that had windows on the back, and we would fire a ball around, trying not to get hit by it, and in some way while away the hours of childhood, waiting for our parents to pick us up. And you would often sit on benches in between these different racquetball courts. Kids could only use up a small amount of the courts because you had paying adults in other ones, so we would spend a lot of time sitting on benches, and every single racquetball court was assigned a single-digit number. Court number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And they had what to me was a mind-blowing aesthetic, which was not just a dull black number in vinyl sitting on a white wall, but this tilted, otherworldly digit with various colored lines coming out of the top and bottom and extending not just up, but around the corner. There's clever printing terms for this, but what did I know? I just saw something that felt like it was out of the ordinary. When we have something new, Whether it's a product or space or creative work, there's an opportunity there. You can either fall into line with what has been there before to ensure and signal to others that you are a continuation of what's expected, or if you're trying to convince people that you're something new, worth investing in, worth spending time with, like, say, a massive Megagym on the end of a very quiet town, well, you would want to have even the numbering system of your courts reflect that. Nowadays, you would show somebody these lines and they would scream 1970s to them. It would have a very specific period of human history when this design was acceptable. Anybody who spent time looking at aesthetics will realize that there are actually these overlapping periods of different designers who rise ascendant, who sell a large aesthetic idea, and then over the next few years, it's adopted by different groups as they are both trying to stay ahead of the curve and dealing with clients who are a few years behind. As a result, there aren't really chronological blocks at play. There's waves ebbing and flowing for different periods of time. As I get older, I really have started to internalize what that all means. Understanding what designers are trying to achieve, well, it fascinates me. I'm sure other people find the story behind the story fascinating in whatever field they're looking at. But in design, the difference between how this designer expressed themselves both internally with concept sketches and also externally with coming up with ideas for what will sell, it's fascinating. When time goes on, we get access to these behind-the-scenes documents, the ones that tell why these decisions were made, or maybe why these decisions were not made. And I feel enlightened, because it shows me that what sits out in the world, especially when I find it boring, represents not an inability of people to be creative or to have imagination. It's just, if you're relying on people who are investing large amounts of money to make decisions, they may not want something to be unlike anything that came before. While I don't have an easy way for you to go to Allsport and see these murals, which are still there in the 21st century, I can tell you to go to the internet and look for Apple Computer and Frog Design. In the 1980s, Steve Jobs asked Frog Design, a design house, to design the next potential generations of Apple products. And what they came back with were not designations of the technological ability of the company at the time, but an imagining of what aesthetic would be interesting, compelling, sell well for the next generation of Apple products. They are completely decoupled from the conservative investment of engineering trying to build things right. Many of Apple's products show this approach of building to the idea instead of wrapping ideas around the known quantities. There's even a through line back to the never-created Atari arcades of the 1970s, imagining a whole different aesthetic of human interaction with machinery, divested from whatever the circuit boards were that were inside. There's been times that I've been in airports that had extremely modern new design, and I see a worker opening up a panel to do work. And it's always the same machinery inside, the same hinges and motherboards and wayward wires, because those are the building blocks of accomplishing things on an engineering level. But once they close that box, there's a glowing plastic promise sitting around them. The font which they did not use at Allsport, but which I saw everywhere, is called Data 70. If you look it up, you'll know what I'm talking about. This is the font of the future from the past. It's the font that went everywhere. Created to be easily machine readable, it took on a life of its own, and it walks among us, feeling in both ways, like something from a beautiful future, but also stuck irrevocably to 50 years ago. The past's idea of the future. And what I'm getting to here is that when I see either of these, the Data 70 font or lines one after another, not necessarily a rainbow, but different shades of color, clearly defined from each other, 4 or 5 lines curving around corners or up ceilings or around doors, I feel transported. I feel compelled. I can't tell you if it's the look itself, if it contains any value, or if it's just a young boy wishing his parents were back together, sitting on a bench, waiting for a game he may or may not really want to play. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to James Bighoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Maybe there's a font that you have far beyond what it is itself and representing memories, hopes, and dreams you've had. I think in the aggregate, it's really nice to have a feeling, warm and familiar, centered around something you can bring back so easily.